So in this chapter, chapter 1, the first chapter of the textbook, what we're trying to do here is now kind of talk about why academics do research or why research is useful for social scientists or just academics in general. And what we see here is that, one way of looking at how we generate knowledge would be through non-scientific methods or methods that wouldn't involve you having to do a research proposal or come up with a systematic study of things. The one issue here would be for personal experience would be that kind of seeing is believing. There's that age-old phrase that seeing is believing, and the reason why something like that is so believable is because it's quite powerful, right? You've seen it with your own eyes. Your senses have told you that this is the way it is. And so personal experiences are incredibly strong, and it's actually quite difficult then to convince someone otherwise. Let's just do I'm just thinking about this. I'm looking out my window right now, and as I look at the terrain, the world looks flat, right? Because the surface, the Earth looks flat from the surface that I'm seeing, right? So it wouldn't, if someone then were to tell me that the world is round, I can't, my senses don't tell me that that's the case, and in fact, I've seen it flat. So you could see how difficult it would be then to overcome that. Then when we start to talk about then the 5 types of errors that this generates, the one problem that we start to see here is overgeneralization. And overgeneralization is that there is some believable evidence that exists, and then we extend it to other situations, or we make a generalization, right? So here would be something like, let's say that I believe my sister is lazy. So if I think that my sister is lazy, I might think that all females are lazy based on this one person that I know who happens to be female and is my sister. Obviously, it's not true, and but again, you might have an uncomfortable conversation, or you might feel quite confused as you confront then females who are hardworking, right? Because of that one personal experience that you had. Then there's the case of the selective observation. In the selective observation, what we're doing is we're taking selective notice, or basically emphasizing certain things to the neglect of others. So this would be something like saying, I don't know, taxi cab drivers are horrible drivers, right? Because I might be focused on speed, I might be focused on the fact that he doesn't use his directional, but then there might be other things that I'm not thinking about, right? That he stops at red lights, and doesn't go through them, that he always puts on his seatbelt, and encourages everyone else to do the same. So, right, I might be overly focused on speed and not on the other things that he's doing to make the cab ride safe. Then we've got the premature closure. This tends to happen when someone basically closes their mind to new information because we think that they know the answer. Sometimes we also liken this to someone being overly confident, right? That they don't need to listen to their coach, or they don't need to listen to their peers because they think that they know what's going on. Then we've got the halo effect. And here what's happening is that we overgeneralize based on something that we believe to be overly positive, right? So I might go to a certain school for college, and it's a school really well known for its biology department, but I am in the English department, right? And the school is well known because of that biology department, right? And so everyone thinks highly of it. But it turns out that they have a really bad English program. But that doesn't matter, right? Because then I tell people, oh yeah, I went to XYZ school. And they're focused on that, not the fact that I'm coming from a poor major within that same institution. And then finally, and I should say too, and the book mentions this as well for the halo effect, is that we see this with celebrity endorsements. And, for some reason I was thinking of the Kardashians, right? Think of all the things that the Kardashians are endorsing, and, we're not even thinking too much about the usefulness, whether we should actually be buying that kind of thing. And then finally, we have the false consensus. And that would be that we have a hard time distinguishing between what we personally believe and what others believe. And so when that's the case, then we'll have some issues dealing with, trying to reconcile our personal beliefs. Okay. Extending this a little bit further with the non-scientific production of knowledge, we see this happening as well when it comes to experts and authority. Right, so the first one we had there on the previous page was dealing with that idea of the personal experience and common sense. So building on that, in the experts and authority, that would mean that we believe something only because someone in authority tells us that is the case. It could be someone who is knowledgeable, right, has training to be knowledgeable about that kind of thing. So this would be something like a geologist telling me that an earthquake is going to strike, within this year in Hawaii. And that might be knowledge that might be more believable, right? Because that's someone with a great deal of knowledge about that kind of thing. Or it could be the governor saying that there's going to be an earthquake coming. That's a little bit trickier because I don't exactly know what's inspiring the governor to say that, right? Is he just want people to be prepared? Did his experts tell him that that's the case? So then really, in actuality, he's just an extension of the authority figures. Don't exactly know. Then we have the popular media messages. This is quite problematic. This could be I don't know, turn on the local news, right? The local news starts off, with 5 to 10 minutes of shootings and, people getting beat up and people getting robbed and all these horrible things. And so it's no wonder that one would think that the world's a pretty scary place. But then right at the end of that same thing, right, we forget about all the nice things that people do for one another, right? Someone finding someone's wallet, someone helping someone cross the street, all these kinds of things. And then finally we get to the ideological beliefs and values. This would be, something like the one I was thinking of, when I read this in the book was something more like what we all tend to think about climate change, and whether you believe that climate change is in fact real or not might be influenced by what your political beliefs are, right? Or it might be what your beliefs about how useful science is, or even what academics should they be individuals that are trusted. These are all things that lead us to producing knowledge in a non-scientific way. Well, the whole fact of the matter is that this course is trying to overcome these things. The way in which science starts to overcome these things goes back to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So quite simply, basically, if this course had existed before Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, we wouldn't have to be doing this course. But that's not the case. In the Enlightenment, there was focus on this kind of logical reasoning, being careful observers of things, questioning doctrines, if we think about things like the world being flat, right? The church, the Catholic Church told us that, everything revolved around the sun, right? And it takes observations, it takes reasoning to overcome those things. And then finally, you can really observe it. Things like the world being round when we can finally go into space in the 20th century. And the reason why the Industrial Revolution is listed here is because the Industrial Revolution, even though it focused on things like assembly line and extending power to things, then what we could think about though as well is that the Industrial Revolution, what it did is it allowed us to spread scientific thinking to social problems, to the social world. And as you do that, what you start to see then is that society can change as we think about things scientifically, that science can do something more than just allow us to produce things faster and cheaper, that it can affect great change. And so then what is science? Science is something more than just biology or science or or chemistry as a science or something along those lines. Rather, what it is the systematic way in which we produce knowledge, and science is then a system in which we create that factual knowledge and then communicate it to others. The big difference is then being that we have the natural sciences versus the social sciences. There we start to see things like chemistry, zoology, astronomy as natural sciences versus economics and psychology and economics as social sciences. And you start to see some disciplines, especially things like psychology and economics, which sometimes try to define themselves as more of a natural science than a social science. And that's always kind of part of the debate. When we look at the social theory, here what we're doing is then we're trying to look at this way in which how those ideas are connected with one another, how we organize those ideas with one another. And the data that we then use to help organize things, to justify things, that comes then in either a quantitative or a qualitative sense. And it may be the case then that that data that we're gathering, whether it be quantitative or qualitative, that we then can think about this from an empirical standpoint. And when I'm saying approach this from an empirical standpoint, what I'm saying is that we're observing things, we're experiencing things directly, or we're using some techniques that allow us to observe things or experience things that we otherwise couldn't do. So with these 4 slides, we then basically have set the stage for what your life looked like when you were a kid, right? And making things based on personal experience. Or what we would even say is that when we say that someone's being ignorant, we're basically saying that people act based on their personal experience, not based on what science tells them to be the case. But that since you, by taking this course and subsequent courses, at some point you will be a college graduate. And being a college graduate, one of the defining features of being that college graduate is that you think about things from this scientific approach. Okay, so there are ways in which some individuals or some groups might try to then cloak themselves in science and claim that they are a science when in fact they are not. And the reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to attract themselves to these features of it being a system, of it being rigorous to generate truths. Well, what a pseudoscience does is it looks like a science. It talks in scientific ways. It has every appearance of being a science, but it's hoping that the individuals who follow that pseudoscience then also don't look at it close enough that they see that there's no rigor or that there's no standards. An example of a pseudoscience would be something like reading palms, right? My wife can read palms, and she'll read my palm and say, well, this line means this, and the fact that this line connects with this line means this. Well, I'm not saying that my wife isn't scientific, but right, when when I'm saying, why are you saying that this is going to happen in my future? She's saying this line explains it, right? So you would think of it as a science where this line existing means X, Y, Z tends to happen. But that's not the case, right? There is some non-scientific way in which that line has been attached to that kind of thing happening to a person. Pseudosciences as well would be things like sometimes you see this with like church explanations for scientific principles, right? And it not having citations to the scientific literature, but rather citations to the Bible or some other types of religious work. In adjunct science, what you do is you see then it's hard to deny science, and that's what junk science is really trying to capture here. If I wanted to critique climate change, and I'm just picking that because it is an example that we see quite oftentimes in the news, the groups that tend, and not all the time, this is a bit of a generalization, but the groups that tend to criticize climate change research are those that are quite conservative, that we typically think of as being in the Republican Party. And the best that one can do, because it's hard to deny then the facts of I measure the temperature and I see it going up 1/10 of a degree, or I look at glaciers and I see them melting. So it's hard to criticize that, right? Because there are observations that make that to be the case. What I do is I call it junk science. So then I'm kind of diminishing the value that we all give to that science. It's a public relations term. And so I'm using it to criticize, and the reason why I'm doing it isn't because I have a better scientific theory for climate change or whether it exists or not. Rather, I just want to quiet down those who say that it exists by diminishing the authority that being a climate change scientist gives them. If we look at the scientific community then, what we then see is these two distinctions between innumeracy and scientific literacy. Innumeracy essentially means that you lack the literacy in quantitative dealings, right? So not good at math would be your quite simple description of what innumeracy means. Whereas in scientific literacy, or lack thereof, we're kind of talking about this ability of people to understand and apply scientific knowledge. Now, the reason why these are on the same slide is I want you to draw at least some connections in between the bottom and the top of this slide, right? That those who lack scientific literacy sometimes might be more inclined to believe in pseudoscience, might be more inclined to call something else a junk science, or not be able to understand a debate between those who say that science is true versus those who say it's a religion, much like being a Catholic, me having Catholic beliefs, that those beliefs in astronomy are the same kind of thing. When we think of science and religion, though, we tend to think of them as being quite different things. Now, when we look at the scientific community and we think about what the norms of that community are, norms are basically rules, principles. More oftentimes they are, as rules and principles, they are oftentimes unwritten. And we're just looking at the way that scientists or researchers conduct research. And these are the 5 common principles or values that researchers share. The first one, and the important one, being universalism. And what that applies to here is that the research is only judged on its merit. That theoretically it shouldn't matter where you are writing from. This is important because we see universalism in its most ideal sense. It shouldn't matter that I teach at Harvard versus I teach at Leeward Community College, right? That if I'm a researcher and I'm doing my work and I'm publishing my work, it should be judged the same based on the results and the rigor that's employed. It turns out that's not the case in reality, right? That we do know that people oftentimes look at the affiliation first, or if you're a researcher, who you did your dissertation with, and then might look at then the ideas that you're trying to talk about second. In organized skepticism, what this essentially means is that we should be, in some sense, a doubting Thomas. Look at that nice religious reference. In this case, we should be incredibly careful about accepting these new ideas. Doesn't mean we're ignorant. It just means that we are a skeptic, that we want to see the proof. We want to run the data ourselves, maybe. We want to be informed how this theory, how this hypothesis was tested. Quite importantly is that the researcher typically should be disinterested. If I build on this climate change example, I should be less trusting of a researcher that is coming from, Save the Polar Bear Fund, right? Because that's going to be a group of pretty, pretty well funded and interested environmentalists. And so they are going to be overly concerned about any research that is against or is, trying to disprove climate change. And so as a result, what we would expect is that we give less credibility to them than to me as a independent researcher at a university. Because theoretically, right, it's the university that employs me. And especially if I have tenure, which means that I can't be, fired for just saying that I don't believe in climate change or I believe in climate change, then I should be, at its peak, completely disinterested. And I would argue that this is the reason for tenure, is to preserve the disinterestedness of the researcher. And that's the goal, right? That I can then write and do research however I deem fit and wherever the results lead me. Communalism is quite important in scientific community because it means that I then have to share my ideas with others. And you see this typically with me publishing research or me going to a conference to talk to others in my field about the research that I'm doing. And then finally, we need honesty. That just goes without saying. You can't really believe anyone if they lack that kind of honesty. Now, what we see here then, if we look at what this, what research involves, the approach that's taken, is that the scientific method is used. That scientific method means things of forming a hypothesis, coming up ways to test that hypothesis, and then actually testing the hypothesis. And then once you conclude what the results are telling you, then you revise and retest that hypothesis. Within the journal publication process where I'm sharing those ideas, the review process should be blind, meaning that I don't know who I don't know who's reviewing my research to get it published, right? That and it may be the case. It could be a single blind review or a double blind review. In a single blind review, only the reviewer that works for the journal is determining whether my research is relevant, but they know my name. In a double blind research review process, the editor doesn't know my name, I don't know their name. And then you've got, theoretically speaking, a truly honest way of approaching the data and the greatest amount of skepticism in a healthy fashion. And then what we then focus on is this transformative process, the way in which ideas are transformed into new knowledge. And that's what the journal articles, eventually lead to textbooks, to new ideas, and new ways that we talk to others. Now, when we look at this research process, I want you to focus especially in this chapter on pages 17 to 22. A great deal of the quiz for this chapter will focus on that material, and I would probably imagine that most of the questions on the final exam would come from that pages 17 to 22. When you look at this research process and you look at it from the quantitative approach, so now we're going to distinguish the quantitative from the qualitative. Within the quantitative approach, I've got the theory. I've got what what the textbook tells me should be the case. So then I've got my topic that then leads to me forming a question about that topic that I then think about how I'm going to answer that question. I collect the data, analyze it, interpret it, inform others, and then I would say it almost then 7 almost leads then back to 2, where I focus on revising the question and leading back to those things. So, and this is what you see here. I'm not going to extend it any further here. Again, this is covered very well in pages 17 to 22. In the qualitative approach, there are some distinct differences here, because what you're doing is, now, and I should say this too, just so that everything is out there. Again, I'm an economist, so my focus is overwhelmingly on the quantitative approach. But for those in the other disciplines here, for the qualitative approach, what we're looking at is an acknowledgement first of the social self. Then once you think about your biases and your perspective, then you design a study based on what you're trying to answer. Collect the data. The data still exists. It's just in a non-numeric fashion. And then you're analyzing, interpreting. And again, just like I said in the previous 2 slides previous, that number 7 is then going back to number 2, ideally speaking, as you start to close back the loop. And there you've got your qualitative description here. And I'm not going to add to this again. This is coming from pages 17 to 22. And when we then look at these approaches, to social research, and we look at it from the quantitative sense, is that we see the things that we like to see within this social research is that the observations are made in an objective fashion, that there's a focus on the variables and how well they attach themselves to what you're trying to look at. How reliable is that data in trying to describe the phenomenon that you're talking about? What kind of generalizations can I make from it? Also, I want a large N, meaning I want a large population that I'm trying to look at. And then obviously there's a rigor to the statistical analysis that I'm doing. In the qualitative approach, though, we see things a bit differently. Here I'm looking at maybe certain events that happen that lead me to start to think about that topic. How situational is it? I actually don't want a large N in this case. I want a small N because I'm doing things like a case study. I'm looking at a very micro kind of things here to draw general themes. Okay, so that really sums up chapter 1 here. It's just getting you in that research mindset, helping you further understand why this course exists towards the end of your program as a 300 level course, but then also starts to emphasize the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative approach and why each approach does have some role in this.